The night over eastern Ukraine was pierced by the steady hum of drones and the dull rumble of distant artillery. It was just before dawn when Ukrainian units began moving again toward Pokrovsk, a city that had become both a symbol of resistance and a measure of Russia's failing control. The operation began with precision-coordinated strikes, drone reconnaissance, and ground units advancing through the blackened ruins of industrial zones. Every meter gained was measured in fire and fatigue, but this time the tide felt different. By early morning, Ukrainian forces had pushed through several Russian defensive layers, liberating more than 180 square kilometers across the Pokrovsk district. Behind these numbers lay something greater than territory. Each liberated town meant a reopened road, a reconnected power line, and one less pocket of occupation. Reports indicated that entire settlements long caught in the crossfire, Kucherev Yar and Suketskoye among them, had returned to Ukrainian control. For the soldiers, these weren't just coordinates on a map. They were fragments of their homeland being reclaimed piece by piece. The speed of the operation shocked many observers. For months, Pokrovsk had been described as a grind zone, where advances were measured in meters and bought with blood. But the Ukrainian counteroffensive demonstrated a shift in tempo, not just tactically, but psychologically. Russian forces, once confident in their fortified positions, were caught off balance. Communications collapsed. Armored convoys burned under precision artillery. Drone footage revealed Russian infantry retreating chaotically through debris-strewn streets. This was no longer the same war that began in 2022. Ukraine's approach had evolved, blending NATO-trained coordination with homegrown innovation. Drone teams relayed live footage to frontline commanders. Mobile artillery units struck and relocated before counterfire could land. What looked like chaos from afar was in reality a carefully synchronized symphony of resilience. And as Pokrovsk's eastern edge lit up under artillery flashes, a broader truth became clear: Ukraine was not merely defending anymore. It was dictating the pace of battle. Western analysts noted that the operation bore the hallmarks of adaptive warfare. Instead of relying on brute force, Ukrainian forces exploited weak points, cutting off logistics and striking supply depots before Russian reinforcements could respond. Intelligence from local networks, civilians, and partisan groups operating behind enemy lines provided crucial guidance. One Ukrainian commander described the strategy as pressure by precision, overwhelming the enemy not with numbers but with focus. Meanwhile, the Russian side faced growing disarray. Satellite imagery showed destroyed armor and scattered formations, symptoms of a military machine stretched beyond its limits. Even pro-Russian bloggers began to admit that the Pokrovsk line was faltering. The losses were too concentrated, the morale too thin. For Moscow, it was a grim reflection of how far its once vaunted offensive capacity had eroded. Beyond the tactical victories, the Pokrovsk breakthrough also carried a symbolic weight. It reminded Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike that progress was possible after years of attrition. Across social media, images of Ukrainian flags rising over reclaimed town halls flooded timelines, sparking rare moments of unity in a war-weary nation. For families waiting in Kiev, Dnipro, or Odessa, these scenes meant hope, fragile but tangible. And yet, even amid the celebration, the cost was evident. Each advance left behind fields scarred by shellfire and villages reduced to rubble. Humanitarian convoys followed closely behind the military columns, delivering food, water, and medical aid to residents emerging from basements after months in darkness. The war's physical toll was mirrored by a deeper psychological exhaustion, both in Ukraine and within the crumbling Russian ranks. As the sun finally broke over Donetsk's horizon, soldiers rested on the edges of newly cleared positions. Radio chatter crackled with cautious optimism. They had retaken ground once thought lost forever. But everyone knew the fight was far from over. The day's light revealed more than victory. It exposed how fragile control could be, and how relentless the struggle for freedom remained. The question now lingered: if Ukraine could turn a stagnant front into a breakthrough, what might come next, when the counteroffensive spread to even more contested regions? In the days that followed, the Ukrainian counteroffensive around Pokrovsk accelerated into a sweeping momentum that few analysts had predicted. Satellite images and battlefield reports confirmed the liberation of 9 settlements and the clearing of 9 more from Russian sabotage units. Each liberated village told a similar story: hastily abandoned trenches, burned-out vehicles, and scattered Russian equipment, evidence of an army losing its cohesion. The Pokrovsk axis, once one of the most entrenched sectors of the Donetsk front, now became the scene of one of Russia's most severe setbacks since 2023. Ukrainian infantry, supported by reconnaissance drones and mobile artillery units, executed what commanders described as a rolling liberation. Rather than attacking along a single axis, multiple battalions advanced simultaneously, cutting Russian communication lines and forcing withdrawals across several kilometers. The coordination was textbook NATO doctrine: fast, decentralized, and lethal. Ukrainian intelligence reports painted a clear picture of the enemy's unraveling. Within 10 days, Russian forces had lost more than 1,700 men and 75 pieces of equipment in the Pokrovsk sector alone. Over 2 months, total losses climbed beyond 15,000 personnel, a staggering figure even by the war's brutal standards. Nearly 1,400 Russian armored vehicles, artillery systems, and transport trucks were destroyed, along with thousands of drones. Each destroyed UAV represented a loss not only in technology, but in Russia's ability to see, target, and coordinate. This shift in the balance of combat power revealed a deeper truth about Ukraine's strategic evolution. Gone were the days of static defense and desperate counterfire. The Ukrainian military had transformed into a mobile, adaptive force capable of reshaping the front lines through speed and intelligence. Western-supplied systems, from long-range artillery to night vision drones, were integrated with Ukraine's own innovations, creating a battlefield network that allowed real-time coordination. Analysts from Europe and the United States described the Pokrovsk offensive as a mirror of modern hybrid warfare. It combined traditional ground combat with cyber operations, electronic warfare, and psychological tactics. Even Russian communication networks were disrupted by targeted jamming, leaving frontline units blind and isolated. In one intercepted communication, a Russian commander was heard shouting for artillery support that never arrived. His message lost in a storm of electronic interference. But while Ukraine's operational success was clear, the battle also highlighted the widening social divide inside Russia itself. The front lines were filled largely with conscripts from poorer, ethnically diverse regions, Dagestan, Buryatia, Tuva, where mobilization had reached devastating levels. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, life continued almost normally, insulated from the war's blood cost. This imbalance turned the war into a quiet class and ethnic divide. Poor regions paid with lives. The elites of the capital paid with silence. It was the Kremlin's unspoken bargain: distant provinces would shoulder the burden so that central Russia could maintain its illusion of stability. Inside Russia, that illusion was beginning to crack. Telegram channels from the republics began circulating casualty lists, hundreds of names from towns most people in the capital had never heard of. Mothers in Dagestan started asking why their sons were dying for land they'd never seen, while officials in Moscow remained unmoved. The Kremlin's propaganda spoke of defending the motherland, but the human geography of death told a different story, one of exploitation and inequality. Back in Pokrovsk, the human reality of liberation stood in sharp contrast. Civilians emerged from cellars clutching Ukrainian flags that had been hidden for months. soldiers shared food with residents who hadn't seen fresh bread in weeks. Field engineers worked through the night to restore electricity and water lines. For many, the return of Ukrainian control meant more than safety. It meant dignity, the right to live without fear of arbitrary raids or forced conscription. The rhythm of the counteroffensive continued, and with it came a quiet question echoing through both sides of the front. If Ukraine's adaptation was outpacing Russia's machinery, how long before Moscow's political armor began to fracture as well? By late October, the scale of Russian losses around Pokrovsk could no longer be downplayed, not even by state media. The figures spoke for themselves: over 15,000 Russian soldiers lost in just 2 months. Nearly 1,400 vehicles and artillery systems destroyed, and thousands more damaged beyond repair. Drone footage from the Donetsk region showed columns of scorched armor, lifeless trenches, and fragmented supply convoys abandoned in the open. What began as a regional counteroffensive had become a brutal audit of Moscow's military strategy and its illusions of control. The collapse wasn't merely numerical, it was structural. Russia's logistics were breaking under the weight of their own overextension. Supply lines stretched thin across mined roads. Fuel shortages delayed reinforcements, and field hospitals overflowed, unable to treat the continuous influx of wounded. In the skies, Ukraine's air defense network had become increasingly lethal, intercepting Russian drones and cruise missiles at rates once thought impossible. Each destroyed drone deepened the fog of war for Russian commanders, who relied on aerial reconnaissance to coordinate artillery fire. A Western analyst summarized it bluntly: Russia is fighting a 20th century war against a 21st century army. The description was not hyperbole. Ukrainian forces now operated with a digital precision that contrasted starkly with Russia's decaying command hierarchy. Real-time intelligence shared between reconnaissance units and artillery batteries turned battlefields into constantly shifting maps of opportunity. Targets identified by drones were eliminated within minutes. Meanwhile, Russian units deprived of reliable communications fought as isolated fragments rather than coordinated armies. The political implications were just as severe. Inside Russia, the mounting casualties began to chip away at the Kremlin's narrative of steady progress. Local governors in Siberia and the North Caucasus were quietly overwhelmed with funerals. Telegram channels, once filled with patriotic fervor, now carried videos of grieving families and soldiers' wives pleading for information about missing husbands. One such video from Buryatia showed a mother reading the names of 47 young men lost in Pokrovsk, all from the same district. It spread faster than censorship could suppress it. The Kremlin's appalling silence in the face of such suffering only deepened public resentment. While Moscow's elites dined under chandeliers and discussed special military operations, entire rural communities were hollowed out. The inequality was glaring, and the capital draft offices remained quiet, but in the regions, mobilization officers went door to door. Many of those conscripts had been promised bonuses or citizenship for their families, promises that vanished with them on the battlefield. The war had ceased to be national. It had become extractive. The Pokrovsk disaster also exposed another truth. Russia's political armor was cracking. Small, scattered movements began to reappear, the most significant among them the soldiers' mothers' networks that had once shaped public discourse during the Chechen wars. Though not openly political, these groups wielded a different kind of pressure moral defiance. They demanded lists of the dead, accountability from local military offices, and the return of bodies. Each demand, however small, punctured the state's monopoly on truth. Social media especially. Telegram amplified their voices. Banned journalists and exiled bloggers helped disseminate casualty data, satellite images, and testimonies from soldiers' relatives. The Kremlin could block websites, but not whispers shared through encrypted apps. Even within state institutions, discontent grew quietly. Regional officials complained about the burden of supplying endless manpower, while commanders on the front privately questioned the feasibility of sustaining losses at this scale. As the Pokrovsk front stabilized under Ukrainian control, Western observers noted that the crisis of legitimacy in Russia was becoming harder to disguise. The numbers killed weren't just statistics. They were fractures running through the Russian Federation's social foundation. The Kremlin's reliance on rural, non-Slavic populations had created an internal imbalance, an empire feeding on its periphery to sustain a failing war. For Ukraine, these fractures were not just distant political developments, they were strategic openings. Each Russian failure on the battlefield eroded confidence in Moscow's propaganda. Each protest, no matter how small, suggested that Russia's ability to sustain this war indefinitely was fading. As the smoke settled over Pokrovsk's ruined outskirts, the battlefield had revealed something far larger than tactical victory. It had exposed the cost of imperial ambition, measured not only in tanks and drones, but in the silent suffering of those Russia had long exploited. And with every new loss, the Kremlin's control over its own narrative slipped further from its grasp. Could this growing social and political discontent within Russia eventually prove more fatal to the regime than the war itself? By early November, the war around Pokrovsk had entered a new technological phase. What once depended on artillery duels and tank battles now unfolded in the invisible domains of data signal and code. Ukrainian forces, long forced to innovate under pressure, had turned the skies into their ally. Drones ranging from small commercial quadcopters to heavy combat UAVs became the eyes and fists of a military that understood precision was its greatest equalizer. The statistics told a dramatic story: nearly 4,700 Russian drones shot down in 2 months. Each downed machine meant a blackout in Moscow's tactical awareness and a blow to its coordination. But it wasn't just defense. Ukraine had built an offensive drone ecosystem that could overwhelm positions miles behind the front lines. Operators, often stationed in repurposed factories or underground command posts, directed swarms of drones against supply depots, command centers, and even individual vehicles. In many cases, these operations were guided by artificial intelligence systems capable of identifying heat signatures and movement patterns in real time. Russian commanders found themselves increasingly blind and paralyzed. Their attempts to compensate through armored assaults only exposed them further. Between mid-October and November, over 40 Russian armored pushes were recorded, yet almost all failed within hours. In the Pokrovsk direction, entire columns were stopped by combined drone and artillery fire before reaching Ukrainian lines. Video after video surfaced online showing Russian vehicles hit from above by precision-guided munitions, their turrets torn away in plumes of fire. Behind these tactical victories lay a deeper transformation in how Ukraine waged war. Western military advisors described it as asymmetric dominance through intelligence. Every successful strike relied on layered coordination electronic warfare units that jammed enemy communications cyber teams, that intercepted Russian radio chatter, and ground spotters who relayed coordinates through encrypted networks. For the first time, Ukrainian commanders had real-time visibility of the battlefield that Russia's top-down command structure could not match. Meanwhile, Russia's traditional strengths, massive artillery, long-range rocket systems, were blunted by shortage and disorganization. Ammunition convoys were ambushed, rail lines were sabotaged. Even in Russian state media, hints of desperation appeared. Commentators began calling for mobilization of engineers rather than soldiers, a quiet admission that the technical deficit was crippling the war effort. This technological imbalance also deepened the political fractures within Russia. Telegram channels loyal to pro-war factions accused the defense ministry of corruption and mismanagement. Others blamed regional governors for failing to supply volunteers. The Kremlin's efforts to control the narrative through censorship proved futile in the age of viral videos. Clips of destroyed Russian tanks and intercepted radio pleas spread faster than state television could deny them. Inside Ukraine, however, these victories weren't celebrated with triumphalism. Soldiers on the ground understood that every drone strike, every destroyed vehicle meant lives lost on both sides. "We adapt faster," one officer explained, "because we have no other choice." That grim necessity had forged a military culture of improvisation, a contrast to Russia's rigid hierarchy. From the social perspective, this difference was profound. In Russia, the poorest regions provided the manpower. In Ukraine, the entire society contributed to defense. Engineers built drones in garages, teachers volunteered in logistics hubs, and civilians crowdfunded entire battalions' worth of equipment. The war, while devastating, had united Ukraine in purpose, even as it exposed Russia's internal inequality and moral vacuum. Western strategists noted that Pokrovsk had become a proving ground for 21st century warfare, a conflict fought as much through digital supremacy as through physical endurance. Each destroyed Russian drone symbolized more than a tactical gain. It was proof that innovation could outmatch brute force. But amid Ukraine's success, a haunting question persisted. Could Moscow adapt, or would its political paralysis and decaying industrial base render it incapable of catching up? Amid the thunder of artillery and the hum of drones, a quieter story unfolded in Pokrovsk. One not measured in square kilometers or destroyed tanks, but in the resilience of human lives. In the newly liberated areas, Ukrainian soldiers and civilians came face to face after months of separation. Entire families emerged from cellars, shielding their eyes from daylight that felt foreign after so long in darkness. Their voices trembled with disbelief. Is it over? Soldiers, equally exhausted, simply nodded. For them, each embrace was worth more than any battlefield statistic. But behind the joy lay an unspoken cost. Nearly every town had its scars burned, schools shattered, hospitals, roads lined with the remnants of Russian vehicles. And among the debris, humanitarian workers rushed to restore power, deliver water, and bury the dead. What had once been homes were now silent memorials. Yet even here, amid destruction, a new kind of defiance grew. Residents painted blue and yellow flags on broken walls. Children played in the rubble, shouting the names of Ukrainian heroes. It was life reborn from ruin. For Ukraine, these moments were not just emotional victories. They were strategic ones. Morale became a weapon, an invisible force that strengthened every soldier holding the line. Commanders described how civilians' gratitude fueled their will to fight. One officer interviewed near Pokrovsk said, "We don't fight for maps. We fight for faces." That human focus gave Ukraine a unity Russia could never replicate. Inside Russia, however, the psychological and social cost was spiraling out of control. News of mass casualties filtered through Telegram and local whisper networks, bypassing the Kremlin's propaganda filters. Mothers from Dagestan, Buryatia, and Taiva began gathering in small circles, first to comfort one another, then to demand answers. These women were not opposition figures, but their grief carried moral weight that no state decree could silence. "My son died in Pokrovsk," one mother cried in a viral video, "and Moscow doesn't even say his name." This quiet uprising became what analysts now call soft resistance. It wasn't about slogans or politics. It was about dignity. The soldiers' mothers' movement, long dormant since the Chechen Wars, resurfaced as a decentralized network. Through Telegram channels and encrypted chats, they shared information about missing soldiers, exposed the lies of recruitment officers, and organized vigils that blurred the line between mourning and protest. For a government that demanded silence, even a candlelit vigil was an act of rebellion. In the political sphere, these ripples of discontent began to spread. Regional governors faced mounting pressure as the flow of coffins returned to their provinces. Officials tried to suppress gatherings, but each arrest only fueled outrage. Videos from Yakutsk, Ulan-Ude, and Makhachkala showed mothers being dragged away by police scenes that shocked even loyal Russians. The optics were disastrous. The Kremlin appeared at war not only with Ukraine, but with its own citizens. Meanwhile, back in Pokrovsk, the contrast could not have been starker. While Russian morale crumbled, Ukraine's cohesion solidified. Civilians volunteered as guides for demining teams. Priests blessed soldiers before night patrols. Farmers brought food to checkpoints. This spirit of mutual sacrifice blurred the line between front and home front. Even under constant bombardment, morale remained astonishingly high. Western observers noted that Ukrainian units rotated regularly, ensuring rest and recovery, a practice rarely seen on the Russian side, where soldiers often fought for months without relief. The demographic impact of Russia's losses began to reveal itself. Small towns in Buryatia and Dagestan reported male population declines exceeding wartime records. Labor shortages grew, classrooms emptied. The war had become not only a military failure, but a demographic catastrophe, a slow bleed of Russia's future. Experts warned that if current casualty trends continued, some minority republics could lose an entire generation within a decade. As Pokrovsk stabilized under Ukrainian control, the human contrast between the two nations stood in painful clarity. Ukraine battered yet unified, Russia vast yet hollow. The Kremlin's obsession with conquest had devoured its own sons, while Ukraine's defense had turned into a national rebirth. And so, as evening fell over the battered streets of Pokrovsk, one could sense that the war's center of gravity was no longer measured in artillery range. It was in the hearts of those who still believed that freedom once reclaimed could never again be taken. Could moral endurance more than missiles or manpower prove to be Ukraine's ultimate weapon? By the time winter clouds began to gather over the Donetsk horizon, Pokrovsk had become more than a battlefield. It was a symbol of transformation. Ukraine's forces no longer fought merely to survive. They were shaping the tempo, rewriting the rules, and revealing to the world that modern warfare was no longer decided by the size of an army, but by its resolve and intelligence. The liberation of 185 square kilometers may have seemed modest on paper, but strategically it altered everything. The Pokrovsk breakthrough stabilized the central Donetsk front and reconnected vital logistical corridors. For the first time since the early days of the invasion, Ukrainian commanders could plan offensives without the constant threat of encirclement. Western analysts began referring to Pokrovsk as the operational hinge, the point where momentum finally began to tilt toward Kyiv. In Washington and Brussels, the victory bolstered political will to maintain support packages, including precision artillery systems and advanced reconnaissance drones. Yet the deeper meaning of Pokrovsk was not military, but moral. It proved that a country under siege could still adapt, innovate, and strike back with intelligence rather than despair. Ukraine's modern war doctrine, a synthesis of NATO tactics and local ingenuity, had become a global case study. Military academies from Warsaw to Washington examined how a smaller, resource-limited nation had outmaneuvered a larger aggressor through flexibility and public unity. Inside Russia, however, the ripple effects of the defeat were seismic. Internal divisions that once simmered beneath the surface began to fracture openly. Governors from poorer republics complained of impossible mobilization quotas. Defense contractors, pressured to meet impossible production demands, resorted to substandard materials and corruption. Even within the Kremlin's inner circle, conflicting voices emerged, some urging escalation, others seeking negotiation. The Pokrovsk loss had punctured the illusion of invincibility that President Putin's regime had cultivated for over 2 decades. The social consequences were impossible to ignore. Reports showed that while Moscow's elite continued to profit from wartime contracts, entire provincial economies were collapsing. The gap between capital and countryside deepened into a silent resentment. In Dagestan, young men avoided conscription by fleeing to the mountains or across borders. In Buryatia, families of fallen soldiers began refusing to accept state medals. The Kremlin's narrative of patriotic sacrifice was crumbling, replaced by a growing awareness that this war served the few while destroying the many. Meanwhile, Ukraine's unity continued to harden under adversity. Each success, no matter how incremental, reinforced national confidence. The Pokrovsk victory boosted recruitment, inspired volunteer initiatives, and strengthened public trust in the armed forces. Across Europe, images of Ukrainian soldiers raising their flag above shattered factories reignited international solidarity. The message was unmistakable: the aggressor could still be resisted, and freedom could still prevail. From a geopolitical perspective, the implications were profound. NATO saw in Ukraine a living demonstration of its doctrine deterrence through adaptability. The alliance quietly intensified training programs, expanded intelligence sharing, and tested new electronic warfare systems using battlefield feedback from Pokrovsk. For the first time since the Cold War, the Western defense ecosystem was learning from a non-member ally. For Russia, however, the consequences were existential. Its military machine, once feared for its size, now revealed the fragility of a system built on coercion rather than conviction. Its vast reserves of men and metal could no longer compensate for moral decay and strategic isolation. The empire that sought to subjugate a neighbor had instead exposed its own weakness to the world. And yet, the war was far from over. Ukrainian soldiers knew that every gain could be challenged. Every liberated town could again come under fire. The coming months would test endurance more than ever before, not just on the front lines, but in the halls of global politics, where attention and funding often waver. Still, as dawn once again rose over Pokrovsk, the mood was unmistakably different. The smoke that lingered in the air was no longer only from destruction, it was the residue of momentum shifting. The voices of soldiers on the radio were weary but steady, confident that this time their defense had become a forward march. Pokrovsk was no longer just a city. It was a turning point, the place where a nation under siege rediscovered not only its strength, but its purpose. If this single victory could shift the balance of a war once thought unwinnable, what might happen when Ukraine's resilience meets the world's unwavering support? The Pokrovsk offensive marked a critical turning point in Ukraine's war for survival. Over 185 square kilometers liberated more than 15,000 Russian casualties, and a shattered enemy front revealed the growing sophistication of Ukraine's modern military. Yet the battle's true significance extended beyond strategy. It exposed Russia's internal fractures, the growing divide between rich and poor center, and periphery obedience and dissent. From Dagestan to Buryatia, the burden of war fell disproportionately on marginalized communities, igniting quiet anger beneath the Kremlin's surface. Ukraine, by contrast, demonstrated how resilience and innovation could overcome imbalance. Through precision warfare, social unity, and adaptive leadership, it turned a defensive struggle into an example of national revival. Pokrovsk became a symbol of transformation, from despair to defiance, from defense to strategic control. The battle's echoes now reach far beyond the Donetsk steppe, shaping NATO policy, influencing global military thought, and reminding the world that courage, when coupled with intelligence, can shift the course of history.